He was 6'8" in an era when the average Russian man stood 5'5". He pulled teeth as a hobby. He performed autopsies for fun. He once held a feast in the middle of a lake, seated his guests in a flat-bottomed boat, and had them rowed in circles for 3 hours while musicians played on the shore. Nobody went home. Nobody asked to go home. He was the Tsar of Russia, and he had built his capital city on a swamp, using conscripted serfs who dug its foundations with their bare hands and died by the tens of thousands. He had tortured his own son to death in a fortress dungeon, a son who had done little more than disagree with him. He had melted church bells into cannons, taxed men for wearing beards, and forced the entire Russian nobility to shave, move to a city they hated, dress in clothes they didn't recognize, and pretend they had become European. When he died in 1725 at 52, Russia was unrecognizable compared to what it had been when he seized power. It was also, in ways that would take generations to fully measure, broken in ways it had never been before. This is the story of Peter the Great, the man who dragged Russia into the modern world by force, and what that force actually cost. Peter Alexeyevich was born in 1672, the 14th child of Tsar Alexis by his second wife. He was not supposed to inherit anything. There were older half-brothers ahead of him. There was a whole court built around those half-brothers, a web of families and loyalties and old money that had no particular interest in the energetic, unusual child playing mock military games in the gardens outside Moscow. His father died when Peter was 4. His half-brother Fyodor inherited the throne, ruled briefly, and died without an heir in 1682. The succession crisis that followed was not orderly. Two families, the Miloslavskis, relatives of Peter's half-siblings, and the Narishkins, his mother's clan, competed for control of a 10-year-old boy who was suddenly the most important person in Russia. The Miloslavskis won the first round by triggering a revolt among the Streltsy, the old-fashioned musketeer corps that served as the royal bodyguard. The Streltsy marched into the Kremlin, dragged several of Peter's closest supporters out of his mother's arms, and threw them from the windows onto the pikes of soldiers waiting below. Peter watched this from the steps of the palace. He was 10 years old. He was made co-Tsar alongside his mentally incapacitated half-brother, Ivan V, with his half-sister Sophia acting as regent. Sophia ran the government. Ivan sat on one half of a specially built double throne. Peter sat on the other half and said whatever the court told him to say. Behind the throne, Sophia sat concealed by a curtain, whispering the correct responses through a hole cut in the velvet. Peter found ways to disappear. He spent his boyhood in the villages outside Moscow, drilling regiments of boys his own age in actual military formations, building toy forts that grew steadily larger and less toy-like. He discovered the German quarter, the foreign enclave where Dutch, German, and Scottish merchants and soldiers had lived for generations, carefully kept separate from Russian society by a court that considered Western influence corrupting. Peter walked in and never really left. He learned Dutch. He learned to build boats. He sat in the coffee houses of the quarter and asked questions about ships and guns and mathematics and anatomy and navigation, and never seemed to run out of questions. He befriended a Swiss soldier named Francois Lefort, who became one of his closest confidants and who introduced him to a social world the Kremlin had no category for. Dinners where men from 6 different countries argued about engineering and drank until 3 in the morning. He was 17 when he staged his first coup against Sofia. He was 23 when he finally consolidated full control after Ivan V died in 1696. By then, he had already led 2 military campaigns against the Ottomans at Azov. The first one failed, the second succeeded, largely because he had spent the winter between them building a fleet of 30 warships in the inland city of Voronezh and floated them down the Don River to the Black Sea. No Tsar had ever done anything remotely like that. Almost no one at court had thought it was possible. Peter built the fleet anyway, took Azov, and told his boyars, the old Russian nobility, that things were going to be different now. Then he left the country entirely. In 1697, traveling under a false name as part of a diplomatic mission to Western Europe, Peter spent 18 months in Holland, England, and Prussia, working in the shipyards, visiting arsenals, watching surgeries, sitting in on anatomy lectures, hiring engineers and naval architects to come back to Russia with him. He was 6'8" and traveled under a false name and apparently convinced no one. The Dutch shipbuilders called him Carpenter Peter and let him swing a mallet alongside everyone else. He came home early, summoned by news of a Streltsy revolt in his absence. When he arrived, the revolt had already been crushed. He had it reopened. 8 of the conspirators were broken on the wheel. More than 1,000 were tortured and executed over the following months. Peter personally interrogated many of them. In the evenings, he attended the feasts he had ordered his court to hold, summoned his nobles, and went down the line with a razor, cutting off their beards. Beards in Russian Orthodox tradition were sacred, a mark of piety, a sign that a man was made in God's image. Peter cut them off. The ones who wanted to keep their beards had to pay a tax and carry a token proving they had paid it. The old Russia was going to end. Peter had decided. The Great Northern War began in 1700, and the opening act was a disaster. Peter's army of roughly 34,000 men surrounded the Swedish-held port of Narva in Estonia, a city that gave access to the Baltic Sea, the access Peter needed to trade with and to compete with Western Europe. A Swedish relief force of around 8,000 men arrived under the 18-year-old King Charles XII. Charles attacked immediately, using a blinding snowstorm as cover. The Russian lines collapsed within hours. Entire regiments fled. Senior officers, mostly foreign hires who didn't speak Russian, surrendered en masse. The Swedish forces lost under 900 men. Russian losses ran above 10,000, killed, captured, or drowned in the river trying to flee. Peter was not at Narva when it fell. He had left the day before, ostensibly to accelerate the arrival of reinforcements. Most of Europe interpreted this as cowardice. Satirical prints circulated in Western capitals showing Peter running from the battlefield, dropping his hat. Russian ambassadors in European courts stopped mentioning Narva. Peter melted the church bells into cannons. He had already stripped the monasteries of much of their silver. He reorganized the army top to bottom, replacing the old boyar commanders with officers promoted on merit, drilling units in Western tactics, replacing the antiquated Streltsy formations with regiments that looked like something out of Prussia or Sweden. He conscripted peasants by the thousands. He imposed new taxes to pay for it. When the taxes produced revolts, as they repeatedly did, in Astrakhan in 1705, among the Don Cossacks in 1707, he sent armies to crush them. And in 1703, on a piece of marshy Swedish territory he had just captured at the mouth of the Neva River, he broke ground on the city that would define his legacy. Building St. Petersburg should not have been possible. The site was a delta of islands and marshes where the Neva split before emptying into the Gulf of Finland. The ground flooded regularly. Mosquitoes rose from the water in summer clouds, thick enough to darken the air. The winters were brutal, the soil unstable, the whole site geologically hostile to large stone construction. Peter built it there because it faced west, because ships from Amsterdam and Hamburg and London could reach it directly, because it was as far from Moscow, from the old Russia he wanted to leave behind, as he could get while still being on Russian soil. He conscripted serfs in annual rotations of 40,000 men, one conscript for every 9 to 16 households, depending on the year. They came from hundreds of miles away on foot in gangs, often shackled to prevent desertion. They were supposed to bring their own tools. Many didn't have tools. They dug the frozen earth with their hands and carried the mud in the fronts of their shirts. Tens of thousands died of scurvy, dysentery, and malaria. Wolves attacked work gangs in the early years when the site was still wilderness. The bodies were buried where they fell, under the foundations of the buildings going up around them. Peter banned stone construction anywhere else in Russia. Every stonemason, every architect, every skilled builder in the empire was redirected to St. Petersburg. Nobles who refused to relocate faced the loss of their titles. Wealthy merchants who resisted were threatened with the confiscation of their businesses. The city rose because Peter made it impossible for it not to rise. It was built on what was underneath it, the bones of the people who built it. He designed parts of it himself. He specified road grids and building heights and the placement of canals. He decreed the punishment for defecating outside designated areas, beating with a cat o' nine tails, followed by cleaning it up. He was involved in everything, from the layout of the Admiralty building to the dress code he required of anyone who appeared at his court. European suits, European wigs, no caftans, no beards unless you had paid the tax. He moved the capital there from Moscow in 1712, while the Great Northern War was still going on. In the summer of 1709, Charles XII of Sweden made a decision that reversed the entire trajectory of the war. Sweden had been fighting brilliantly for 9 years. Charles had forced Poland to change its king. He had pushed deep into Russia, pursuing a strategy of decisive engagement rather than territorial occupation. But the Russian winter of 1708 to 1709 was one of the coldest in living memory. Rivers froze solid, birds fell from the trees, soldiers froze to death at their posts. Charles, already wounded in the foot from a skirmish near Poltava in Ukraine, had lost significant numbers of men to exposure and starvation. His Ukrainian ally Ivan Mazepa, a Cossack hetman who had switched sides from Russia to Sweden, hoping to secure Ukrainian independence, had brought fewer reinforcements than promised. The supply convoy Charles was counting on had been destroyed by Russian forces before it arrived. Charles attacked Poltava anyway. The Swedish army that attacked the Russian defensive lines on the morning of June 27, 1709, had somewhere between 18 and 20,000 men, thousands of them unfit for service, running short on powder and shot. Peter's force behind the earthworks numbered around 42,000, fully supplied, supported by artillery on every flank. Peter had spent 9 years rebuilding the army that had broken at Narva. The men behind the earthworks at Poltava were not the same men who had run. The battle lasted 2 hours. Swedish casualties ran above 11,000, killed, wounded, captured. The remainder fled south toward the Dnieper. Charles XII, still barely mobile from his foot wound, escaped across the river into Ottoman territory, where he spent the next several years as an uninvited guest of the Sultan. Peter gathered his officers in the camp that evening, raised a toast, and invited the captured Swedish generals to dinner, including the men who had commanded the forces that crushed him at Narva 9 years before. He seated them at his table, had them served, and told them that Narva had been their teacher, and that the lesson had been well learned. Field Marshal Renskiold, who had commanded the Swedish attack that morning, sat across from the man whose army he had humiliated in 1700, and ate the food offered to him. Poltava changed how Europe looked at Russia. The court in Versailles paid attention. The Prussians took notice. The Poles, Danes, and Saxons, who had watched Peter's enemies tear through them for a decade, began reassessing what kind of power had just emerged on Europe's eastern edge. Peter himself, in the weeks after Poltava, personally supervised the execution of the Ukrainian Cossacks who had fought on the Swedish side. The town of Baturin, the Cossack capital where Mazepa had based his alliance with Charles, was razed and its population massacred. The estimates run to 6,000 dead. The lesson he wanted to communicate was specific. This is what happens to anyone who calculates that Sweden is the winning side. The Great Northern War continued for 12 more years. Charles XII refused to make peace. He ran military campaigns from exile, conspired with every enemy of Russia he could find, and kept fighting until he was shot through the head at a siege in Norway in 1718. In 1721, the Treaty of Nystad gave Russia the Baltic territories Peter had been fighting for since 1700: Ingria, Estonia, Livonia, and a portion of Karelia. Russia now had its window to the west. Peter declared the Russian Empire and took the title of emperor. He was the first Russian ruler to call himself emperor. The Senate and the Holy Synod of the Church presented the title to him formally, in a ceremony of the kind Peter usually found tedious, and he accepted it with the pragmatic acknowledgement that it was useful. European courts were not enthusiastic. The title implied an equality with the Holy Roman Emperor that most of Western Europe was not prepared to grant to a Slavic monarch who had spent his reign sacking monasteries and torturing dissidents. The Prussians and the Dutch acknowledged it. Most of the rest waited. Among everything Peter built and destroyed, the story of his son Alexei is the one that doesn't fit cleanly into any version of the legend. Alexei Petrovich was Peter's eldest son by his first wife, Eudoxia, a woman Peter had married at 17, under pressure from his mother, and then abandoned at 26, forcing her into a convent to clear the way for the foreign women and eventual second wife who suited him better. Alexei grew up largely without his father, raised by aunts and tutors in the conservative Moscow court that surrounded them. He was educated in languages and mathematics. He served in the logistics of Peter's campaigns. He was not stupid and he was not lazy, and he did not conspire in any concrete way against his father's life. What he did was exist as a symbol. He believed in the Orthodox Church as a power independent of the state. He preferred Moscow to St. Petersburg. He liked the old boyar families who resented the disruptions his father had imposed on them. He said so to people who remembered what he said. By the time he was in his 20s, he had become a focal point for everyone in Russia who hated what Peter was doing, not because he sought the role, but because he was there, and he was the heir. In 1716, Peter ordered Alexei to join him at the front with the army, or take monastic vows and disappear into a monastery. Alexei fled to Austria instead, throwing himself on the mercy of his brother-in-law, the Holy Roman Emperor. He wandered between Vienna and Naples for over a year, drafting letters to Swedish commanders suggesting that if Charles XII invaded Russia at the right moment, he, Alexei, might be persuaded to lead the opposition against his father. Peter sent agents to find him. He sent letters promising pardon if Alexei came home voluntarily. Alexei came home in January 1718. The pardon lasted weeks. Peter's interrogators extracted the letters Alexei had written to the Swedes. His associates were tortured. His mistress, a Finnish serf girl named Afrosina who had traveled with him, was brought in and questioned. She told them what she knew. In April 1718, Alexei was moved to the Peter and Paul fortress in St. Petersburg, the dungeon Peter had built at the heart of his new capital. He was whipped 25 times on June 19th. On June 24th, the interrogation resumed. He confessed to conspiring for his father's death. 3 days later, he was dead. The official record says he died of a stroke following the interrogation. Most historians read the evidence as death from the wounds of torture. No European monarch in the 18th century personally oversaw the torture of his own child. Historians have spent years establishing exactly how guilty Alexei actually was. The answer, reconstructed from archives in multiple countries, is somewhat. There were conversations with Austrian officials about a possible revolt. The Swedes had tried to recruit him. Nothing was organized. Nothing had a plan. He was a symbol people talked to, not a conspirator who organized. Peter killed him anyway, because a symbol was enough. The last years of Peter's reign had a quality of accumulating exhaustion that his court grew careful not to notice. He had spent most of his adult life in motion, at the front, on the water, in workshops, in construction sites, in the torture chambers of his secret police. He founded the Russian Academy of Sciences in 1724, 2 years before it actually opened, because he would not live to see it. He organized expeditions to explore the Pacific coast of Siberia and determine whether Asia and America were connected by land. He had hospitals built, and schools founded, and a postal service established. He had spent 52 years as the most energetic person in every room he entered, and his body was keeping accounts. He had bladder and urinary tract problems in his final years that grew steadily worse. In January 1725, the condition became critical. Doctors removed a liter of infected urine. A fever followed. For days, he was conscious enough to be aware that he was dying, and he spent those days trying to manage the succession, and failing. He had changed Russian succession law after Alexei's death, reserving to the emperor the right to name his own successor. He had not named one. He was reportedly conscious enough to call for a pen and paper to write out his decision, and had written 2 words, "Leave everything to," before losing the ability to continue. He never regained enough lucidity to finish the sentence. He died on February 8, 1725. His second wife, Catherine, was declared empress, a political solution brokered by the Guards officers who had been loyal to Peter personally. She ruled for 2 years. After her came a succession of rulers, a 12-year-old boy, a woman with a German accent, another woman with better political instincts, none of them Peter, all of them presiding over an empire his will had built and his methods had organized. His table of ranks, the meritocratic system that determined precedence, by service to the state rather than by birth, functioned until 1917. The institutions of his bureaucratic state, the Senate, the administrative colleges, the subordinated church, were still running when the Romanov dynasty ended. The city he built on bones became one of the most beautiful cities in the world. By the 19th century, it was being called the Venice of the North. Palaces lined the embankments. The Hermitage held one of the great art collections of Europe. The opera houses were among the finest on the continent. Everything Peter had envisioned was visible in stone and plaster and gilt. The serfs who had built it were not visible at all. Their bones were under the foundations. There is a statue of Peter the Great in St. Petersburg that has stood since 1782. A bronze horseman on a rearing horse, one hand extended toward the west, toward Europe, toward everything he spent his life trying to reach. Pushkin wrote a poem about it in 1833, about a poor clerk swept away in a flood, shaking his fist at the statue, at the man who built the city in the place where the floods came. The statue does not move. The clerk goes mad. Peter was, in the Russia of his time and afterward, both God and Antichrist. For the reformers who came after him, for the liberal nobility who wanted Russia to continue its journey westward, he was the indispensable foundation, the man who made everything possible. For the old believers, the religious traditionalists who had watched him destroy the independence of the church and tax their beards and conscript their children, he was the Antichrist incarnate, the man prophesied to destroy true Russian Christianity. For the serfs who built his city, he was neither. He was the power that sent the conscription order. He built a navy from nothing. He broke Sweden, the dominant power in Northern Europe. He created the legal and administrative structures that would hold Russia together for 2 centuries after his death. He founded a city that became one of the great cultural capitals of the world. He sent Russians to study in Paris and London and Amsterdam, and when they came back, Russia had engineers and architects and mathematicians it had not had before. The Grand Embassy of 1697. The trip where he worked the Dutch shipyards under a false name was something no European monarch had done before, and none would do after. He wanted to know how things worked, and he went and found out. He also tortured his son to death. He killed thousands after the Streltsy revolt in ways that contemporaries described as unusually savage, even by 17th century standards. He built his capital on conscripted labor that he replenished when it died because the supply of serfs was effectively unlimited, and the project could not wait. He imposed the table of ranks while doing nothing to alter the fundamental status of serfdom, the system by which the great majority of Russians were legally owned by the nobility and the state. The men who dug St. Petersburg were not citizens who had chosen to work there. They were property, and they were used accordingly. Russia in 1725 could compete with Sweden, with the Ottoman Empire, with the emerging powers of the Baltic. It could not yet compete with England or France or the rising kingdoms of Central Europe. Peter had moved Russia from one position to another, but the distance between where it was and where Western Europe was still ran to generations. His successors would spend the next 100 years arguing about how to close it, whether to close it, and what closing it would cost. Some of them would look at what Peter had done and see a model. Others would look at the same evidence and see a warning. He died without naming his successor, the one decision he had given himself the legal right to make and then failed to make. The empire he had spent his life building spent the next 37 years cycling through incompetent or unwilling rulers before Catherine the Great arrived and stabilized things. This was the story about Peter the Great. Please support my channel by liking this video and subscribing to find a lot of historical content. See you in next video.